I think we should get started. We've got a lot of you have joined, so good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to BCG's post COP26 webinar. My name is Edmond Rhys-Jones. I'm a partner in BCG's social impact practice based in London. And the reason I've had the privilege of leading this session is that I was leading the team that supported the UK government plan, prepare and deliver COP26 over the last 2 years. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. We're going to run through the key outcomes and the implications for business, as well as having a little bit of a look ahead to COP27 and COP28 beyond that. And I'm very keen that we leave at least half the time at the end of the session for your questions. So please do put your questions in the chat. So firstly, if I can just provide maybe a very short bit of context. So for those of you that have not been following climate diplomacy, perhaps as closely as we have over the last few years, COP26 stands for the Conference of the Parties, and it was the 26th Conference of the Party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the convention that was set up at the Rio Earth Summit to bring governments together to solve the climate crisis. And COP26 was a pivotal meeting for a couple of reasons. So firstly, the climate science has become increasingly clear and increasingly urgent around the challenge. So firstly, that climate change is already well underway. We're already a degree over pre-industrial levels. Secondly, that we're on track, certainly pre-conference, if you look at the take a policy lens, we were on track for 2.7 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. And not only are the impacts of the change that has already happened very evident, and we've had a year of seeing droughts and flooding, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world, but also that the impacts of hitting 2 degrees and 3 degrees are catastrophic in terms, I think most importantly in terms of the human impacts, but also in terms of the economic impacts. And then if we look at what is needed, as we entered the start of this decade, the climate science and the IPCC was saying that we needed to halve emissions broadly by the end of this decade in order to keep warming at 1.5 degrees. So really steep cuts are required. So I think huge amount of urgency going into COP26. The other reason it was a pivotal meeting was because the Paris Agreement, that I'm sure many of you are aware of, that was signed in 2015, that set a target of 1.5 and, set well below 2 degrees and best efforts towards 1.5, put in place a mechanism for governments to review and raise their ambition. And by ambition, I mean their commitments to cut emissions by a certain percentage by 2030. And they would come back and review that every 5 years. And 2020 was the deadline for that, for those revised, what are called nationally determined contributions, those revised pledges. COVID meant that that was somewhat delayed, and we ended up seeing a lot of pledges coming in during the course of this year. But this was the first conference where the parties were coming back together in light of those revisions to take stock of where we were and look ahead. So a lot of pressure, given that those pledges were falling short, to address the gap, as it were, and think about what else needed to be done. How could we accelerate? So I think that's enough of the context. I'm joined by several of our climate leaders from across BCG who were both part of our support for COP26 and were in Glasgow for the conference itself. So firstly, we have Rich Lesser, our global chair, who's been supported our efforts COP26 throughout. We have Wendy Woods, managing director and senior partner, and who is vice chair of our social impact practice. We have Michel Frédeau, managing director and senior partner, and the global leader of our climate and environment practice. We have Judith Wallenstein, who's a managing director and senior partner, is head of social impact in Central and Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And last but not least, we have Olga Galin, who was part of the team supporting COP26 and who focused on the non-state actor, or essentially private sector side, so supporting the UN high-level champions for climate action, Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Moyes. So a little bit of housekeeping. Given the interest in today's webinar, we're going to record this session for those who are unable to join. And you're all free to use the information that you hear during this session as you see fit. And we'll also, there's also an executive perspective that was published on Monday that can be recirculated if necessary. Really looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to start with Rich, if I may. Rich, perhaps you could just kick us off by sharing your overall impressions of your time in Glasgow and the run-up.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with all of you. And I remember actually visiting London the very first day of work for me in 2020, thinking 2020 was going to be the year of COP, meeting with Ed and his team because we were supporting COP and to get myself educated and come up to speed for the event later this year. Of course, the world intervened in 2020 with COVID and the pandemic. The COP got delayed. What started as a year-long effort turned out to be a 2-year-long effort. But I'm so appreciative to the huge team that's been so involved on many dimensions in trying to contribute to this incredibly important event. I would like to start with maybe 2 summary themes and then just go through the one page you see on screen here with some of the findings or the key conclusions that we had. The 2 summary themes. I think the first thing to realize is this was really a tale of 2 COPs, very distinct from the history of the prior 25 COPs. And I want to talk about that a second. I think historically, the focus of this event was the political negotiations between leaders from countries around the world. And of course, that was true this year. I'll come back to that in a second. It was high drama. It had enormous uncertainty with very, very large stakes for the world in what came out of it. But what was very interesting about this COP, and that I heard over and over again, this was the first COP that I attended, but I spoke to many people who'd been going for years, sometimes for decades. And to a person, they spoke about the engagement of the broader society, and particularly of the private sector in this COP being truly different from anything they'd ever seen. I think Jules Kortenhorst, the leader of the Rocky Mountain Institute of RMI, had a quote in the Financial Times a couple of days ago that said that there was more private sector engagement in this COP than the prior 8 COPs he'd attended combined. And that comment, said in different ways, was echoed by many others. And I think it really reflected a different level of engagement, but also a different level of commitment, which I'll come back to from that. And the second theme that I think came through is if we judge this COP, and of course history writes these things over years, not over days, I think it will be summarized as one that truly over-delivered against the politics and the incoming expectations. There was so much skepticism about whether we get any agreements. We all know how hard the geopolitics in the world are right now, and that there was a real risk that we were going to get very little out of this. And at the same time, if we're honest, we have to say it still is under-delivering versus the science, particularly the science of trying to get as close as we can to a 1.5 degree world, the amount of financial resources that'll have to go to developing lower and middle income countries that need support, that face the greatest risks, and there's still a long way to go. So we've made very good progress, but nowhere close to being able to declare victory. And we have a decade at least of translating commitment to action ahead of us. So now if I go to the summary page, let me break it into 4 parts. The first 3 items are really about what happened in the core negotiating room, the historic focus of one of these meetings. And there, I think we saw a few encouraging things. The first is that 90% of the world is now committed to net zero. That includes substantial pledges from India and others. That's at a different place than it was. Again, it's about translating commitment into action, but that was a big step forward. We have finally completed the Paris rulebook. That includes the creation of an international carbon market. Article 6, some of you may have heard of, got a tremendous amount of focus and attention, as well as stricter emissions disclosures. So getting that rulebook done was a critical element, and that's now completed. And the third was the language, which for the first time recognizes coal and fossil fuels, talks about a phasing down. I know many of us were hoping that if the language might even be stronger, but I think relative to where we've been historically, that was a big step forward. So there are many other specific components we can get into, but those three are an important starting point for what came out of the core negotiations. The second block is about what happened in parallel among government coalitions on key topics, where COP26 was used as a high-profile forcing event, but not necessarily put into the core negotiating agenda with all the complexity that brings. And so there I would highlight the joint policy commitments on deforestation, methane, and international coal financing. All three of them made substantial progress. I think the one that most people that I've spoken to were particularly excited about was what happened on the methane side, and that methane is such a critical part of the global greenhouse gas warming, because it is so much more impactful than carbon dioxide, and it's one of the areas we can make progress faster. So that was particularly important. And then, of course, the US-China Declaration on Climate Collaboration. We all know that the two countries are at a very difficult place geopolitically. They're really not getting along on so many dimensions. So to be able to come out with a joint statement and to recognize that there was more work to be done after this COP to push things forward, I think was encouraging. Then the next three items 6 through 8, are about the private sector making commitments and about the connection between the private sector and the public sector. 5,200 companies signed up for Race to Zero to get on Paris-aligned pathways. That went up 1,000 companies just in the month before the COP started. 450 financial institutions committed to various elements of GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. The headline number is 130 trillion. We need to be careful to say those organizations represent 130 trillion of assets. It does not mean there's 130 trillion dollars of checks waiting to be written right now. And in fact, how we get our multilateral institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, helping to de-risk some of these is a really important element to unlock that massive amount of capital that is shown a willingness to be on net zero pathways and to be much more transparent in disclosure. And then also more generally a move to more transparent disclosure and reporting. The UK announced that public companies in 2023 will need to describe their plans to get to net zero. I think there are a number of other elements that focused on transparency and disclosure. That is just incredibly important, because we all know the real issue is going from commitment to action. And I think transparency will allow for continued focus, the ability for civil society to check on the progress being made, and frankly, I think a ratcheting up of expectations over time. And then finally, I just want to highlight, as important as it is to reduce the levels of carbon in the atmosphere as fast as we can, at least the levels going into the atmosphere quickly, we also have to recognize the need to focus on adaptation and resilience. And there was at least an acknowledgement in the need to double collective funds for adaptation by 2025. I think many of the countries feeling those pressures feel like we're not yet at an adequate level of the money really flowing in, but there is an acknowledgement of that. And I think hopefully that'll be the foundation for much more to come in the years ahead. So that was a very quick run through of a very intense and dense 2-week meeting, Ed, but hopefully that provides a good starter for others to share perspectives.
Rich, thanks for sharing that. And I suspect we'll have some questions. So again, I'd encourage people to put them in the chat and we will come back to them at the end. Your final point on ANR, I think, is a great maybe segue to Wendy, who I think is probably our most experienced participant at COPs, who's been to the most over the years. Wendy, looking ahead, what are you expecting to see in terms on the agenda at COP27, COP28, maybe even beyond?
There we go. So thank you, Ed. And before I go there, let me just underscore one thing Rich said, which was the sense of momentum and the sense of partnership we felt in this COP. It was incredibly palpable, the difference from Madrid and the difference from previous COPs. And also the interaction of the private sector, corporations and investors with governments. If I roll back to Paris, there was a lot of credit at the time given to private sector in, frankly, giving the public sector the backbone to be able to agree to what it did. And I would say that played out in much, much, much stronger ways this time. And the interaction between the public and private sector was incredibly important. When we think back to Paris again, we talked about 3 different areas. We talked about mitigation, we talked about adaptation, and we talked about financing. And a lot of the wins that you just laid out, Rich, are wonderful and important, and they're on the mitigation side. How do we bring down the greenhouse gases that we are emitting? Where we actually made less progress is how do we grapple with the damage and the problems that are currently being fraught, and how do we adapt and build resilience to make sure that we're prepared for what we know will come, even with all the mitigation that has been committed to and is expected to be delivered. So as we look forward, what do we need to focus even more on, and what can we expect with COP27 being in Egypt, likely to focus very heavily on, are the things like that adaptation and resilience pillar that was originally intended to be balanced. And right now, even with some of the progress over the last couple of years, adaptation funding is only 8% of all of our climate funding. And so we have a long way to go, and especially on things like agriculture, to make sure that we can continue to feed the world where we're already meeting that goal and actually improve where we're not. So you should expect a lot closer attention on the whole adaptation pillar and the resilience pillar for countries, for companies, and certainly for supply chains. There is a bit of framework being put in place around this right now. There was progress this time around things like the UN Global Resilience Index, the Race to Resilience framework, which is trying to provide some visibility, some transparency, some understanding of what the risk is and what can be done to build that resilience and adapt for what we know will be coming. The UK did announce some new funding for this. There's a National Adapt Plan Global Network trying to coordinate this, but again, we're only at 8% in the balance of all climate funding, and we are at a quite paltry amount. I think the latest counts we've had are at about 20 billion of funding for adaptation. The expectation is many times that in terms of what will actually be needed down the road. There were commitments made to double that over the next few years. That actually needs to happen fastly, and ultimately it will need to be significantly more than double. The loss and damage topic was probably one of the more contentious topics at this COP. Tremendous tension between some of the poorer countries and the wealthier countries that have contributed more to climate change, and the poorer countries that have contributed less but are already seeing more of the devastation that is currently being wrought. Loss and damage is expensive. Germany's working to fund about 30 billion for the recent floods that they've had. So there is a call to create a facility or a fund for loss and damage that can support some of the less developed emerging markets around the world. The wealthier countries are concerned about unlimited financial liabilities, and there's been a stall in the negotiations on how that can be taken forward. But it's something we're all going to have to grapple with going forward, and is incredibly important. And as we see around the world, something that we are already grappling with devastating effects of the change we already see happening. One of the other dialogues that's really important is how we make this transition just. And the slide we've got up says Global South, but frankly, it is a global issue. Regardless of where we are in the world, we need to think about what just transition means and how we actually create a major transformation in our economy and actually create the safety system so we are not leaving too many people behind. The justice and equity theme needs to be embedded in so much of what we're doing. And there absolutely needs to be a focus on the North-South collaboration. One of the big wins we saw this time was the South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership. It was an $8.5 billion partnership that was agreed between South Africa and a number of the countries in the north, France, Germany, US, UK, to support South Africa's transition away from coal. This is really significant given how much that economy depends on coal. And when achieved, could probably, in and of itself, this one country, this one partnership could contribute to a reduction of over a gigaton of greenhouse gas emissions. So really important. And we're hearing that this is the kind of foundational partnership that we need to have in many more places. So this was a big win in terms of creating a model for how we can actually take some of these partnerships forward in a really constructive way that can make a very big difference in what we need to achieve. The foundation of this was public-private cooperation. BCG was privileged to support the National Business Initiative in South Africa, the Uniting Business in South Africa, and a partnership with the government to develop the climate pathways. And the climate pathways were what enabled the visibility of what could happen and what should happen to create the basis for that partnership. So a really exciting win for South Africa and the partnership that it has with a number of those countries. So just transition, something to keep on the radar. Initial models that work in this area, and a long way to go in making it much more cohesive and universal across the world. Voice of civil society, it's been there. We all know Greta well, but the voice of civil society was broad and loud and increasingly younger and increasingly vocal and increasingly able to back up their voice with their actions and frankly, their purchasing behavior. I think a lot of us heard and were actually personally completely inspired by Venetia Umashankar when she talked about the leaders of today being the ones who get to decide whether her generation lives in a habitable world. But civil society broadly and young leaders in the youth constituency of the UN framework and the Convention for Climate Change are increasingly pushing and actually having a much more active voice and a much more active influence and much more active with their purchasing behavior. So we should expect to see this continuing civil society advocacy increase, and frankly, more and more consumers starting to vote with their wallets. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wendy. And I think everything you've said, I think, is a great reminder that the UNFCCC and the COP is a process. This was one COP. We need more. We need to keep that conversation going because there's a lot of ground to cover. So thank you for taking us through that. I can see it sparks some questions. Michel, I'm going to turn to you next. I think to pick up that theme around collaboration and perhaps give us a bit of an overview of some of the public-private initiatives and collaboration that we saw in Glasgow.
So thank you, Ed. So as we've discussed, and as we know, until we solve the climate challenge, and it's not done yet, although there's some progress, it's going to be all about delivery, collaboration, and speed. This is where collaboration between private and public is so important. You know, the main objective is quite simple, is on the one hand, make carbonized products more expensive, and this is the role of policy, standards, and in particular, a carbon price, and make decarbonized products available and less costly. In other terms, reduce the green premium, as Bill Gates puts it. And those initiatives that we participated to and we attended to are going exactly in this direction. The first one, the Glasgow Breakthrough, was focused on international collaboration to accelerate innovation to deliver affordable clean technology globally in 2030. And there's a number of sectors, particularly the high emitting sectors, that made pledges, important commitments on high emitting sectors such as power, transport, steel, hydrogen, and agriculture. I think 42 governments representing 70% of global GDP signed up to coordinate the introduction of clean tech. So this one is really a quite important element of it. But that's not enough. The First Mover Coalition that was created with John Kerry and the WEF, and to which we're very proud to participate, was created on another idea. Basically, if you look at the existing technology, let's say 70 to 80% of the existing technologies are today existing and will allow to reduce emissions. So those technologies are there. The question is for half of them to get a full-scale deployment so that they're cost-effective. And that's exactly the spirit of the First Mover Coalition, is to focus on those technologies that are existing but needs accelerated deployment so that they are at the cost level that is acceptable for companies to buy them. And this has gathered companies making pledges on demand. They're committing to demand and to demand in 2030 for decarbonized steel, for decarbonized cement, for decarbonized trucks, aluminum, shipping, airlines are all committing. And there's already 25 founding partners, and we're going to expand that so that then we can turn back to the supply and see and explain that these are committed companies to buy those commodities, and therefore they can accelerate the development of those facilities and supply to be able to serve in a costly basis those companies and those demand. The other one, Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which we're also a partner, is focusing on the 30 to 40 technologies that don't exist today to boost investment into this innovation and these new technologies that we will need for net zero coalitions. So it does cover a number of fields like hydrogen again, sustainable aviation fuel, DAC, and batteries and long-term storage. And this is also an initiative where the commitment from Breakthrough Energy is to commit $3 billion with the hope that we will get more than $30 billion once we get countries and companies investing together to develop these new technologies. And then the other point that I wanted to mention is that when you clearly look at public procurement, you see today that it's the missing link, because those investments today represent $11 trillion that public procurement represent, among which 35% is in high-to-abate sectors. They're buying cement, they're buying steel, they're buying trucks. And I think that's important that we have governments that really make also pledges on their own procurement for the decarbonized product is something that will help to build a critical mass and to also reduce costs as companies supply them. But you need to have pledges that we got, but also disclosure and defining the right standards. And then, of course, there has been also many sector-specific initiatives that are listed there in the different sectors where companies have made very important pledges to show that they're also showing the way. So you see that overall, whether we're talking about existing technologies and their deployment or new technologies that will be required, both on the public sector and the private sectors, this collaboration should help on both the delivery and the acceleration.
Thank you, Michel. And I think some really practical examples there of how business is no longer sitting back and being a passive recipient of regulation and technology change elsewhere, but actually trying to drive that change very actively. Judith, lastly, I'll turn to you, and perhaps you could give the audience a sense of what are the key takeaways from their perspective. What should they be thinking about and doing next?
Yes, thank you, Ed. And you all see Michel has spoken about some of the champions, the early movers who have taken their role in the alliances that he described. And your organization may be part of those or of others that you have formed. But regardless where you stand, what you see on this page is basically how we think about you taking action as business leaders. And we basically look at it in those three buckets that I'll quickly comment on. how you engage quickly and set direction. Because we indeed believe that if you look at COP26, the commitment made offers a lot of room to move fast. And we believe it's a really, really good point in time for companies to embark on it. I'll comment on why in a moment. Then is, how do you collaborate with your ecosystem? What do you do as an organization in isolation, but what do you also do with competitors, with suppliers, with customers? And then finally, what does it mean for your own organization, and what is the change process you are going to run through? If we start on engaging quickly, this is really, and we hear that from many business leaders, how do you now move from pledges to action, to very tangible climate transition plans that are embedded in your strategy, they're embedded in your operations. They start with a really objective baselining on where you stand and how you're going to go down in emissions, depending on where your targets and your pledges stand, with a really clear timeline, what you'd like to achieve by when. Then the second one comes back to what Wendy was describing. You need to adapt your assets and operations to a warmer world. It has happened already. And those of you in industries with plants in parts of the world that are exposed to storms, to floods, who have seen the dent in your growth rates when a single plant gets flooded and takes half a year to rebuild, you have been there. So we see that building adaptation and resilience in your operations plans and in how you build plants and how you think about locations, but also how you think about the whole human side of it becomes a really bigger part of how you engage quickly. And then logically that will happen at very different speeds in different parts of the world that you are active in, and how do you take that into account? Michel talked before about the opportunities to compete for share in the low carbon economy. Also, what are your customers wanting to buy if you look 5 to 10 years down the road? What are some of those scarce technologies that still command a real green premium today, but that you'd like to be part of? And if you see the attention that many companies put, for example, on sustainable airline fuels, because they've made really ambitious commitments to say this is 30% of my airline fuel consumption by 2025, but where am I going to get it from? We actually believe that that is an opportunity to get active now and not hang back and wait for another 5 years. Collaboration within the ecosystem is obviously so important, because if you look at your own emissions, it has to happen along the entire value chain, as we've often discussed. We do, however, believe that it starts working with policymakers, and those can be at state level, they can be federal or local. We see that local governments, large cities, for example, have been incredibly active and really looking at how you set a level playing field and have a shared interest to be more ambitious. How do you group together in your industry or across industries to have a strong advocacy agenda on climate change? These are some of the points we see company engage in now. Then indeed collaborating and co-investing along the value chain. We also see that with regards to the end consumer, whom we mentioned in number 7, we saw a real change in the way how activists argued and discussed at COP, and Wendy was talking about it. A lot of the young activists, for example, are actually advising company leaders in the question of what their generation will want to consume, which choices they make, and what that means for business leaders to transition their portfolios. So that's also why we always stress that point. Engaging with and listening to youth actors is not some symbolic action, but actually a lot of these activists are really changing and are gearing up to advise businesses and bring their perspective into what you're doing. And then finally, how do you bring your employees on the journey early on, understanding really what you're doing, embracing your plans and your ambition, but also understanding that this becomes such an important part of your employer value proposition. And we hear that from companies across many industries. We also hear that from some of the high emitters who feel that they're struggling massively to attract strong talent and who want to put their climate plans really frontline to make sure they can get that talent and actually also live up to their demands. And then finally, how do you not treat the topic in silos, a piece in your comms, a piece in your operations, a bit in your strategy, a lot in corporate affairs, but given that that problem is really, needs to be tackled along your entire supply chain and the ecosystem in which you operate, how do you also make sure you set your own organization up accordingly inside?
Thank you, Judith. I think highlights that just as the challenge is a whole economy, whole society challenge that is global, from a corporate perspective, this is really a whole company effort that's required to both play your part in mitigating and adapting to a warming climate. We've had a few great questions that have come in, which I'd like to turn to now. Maybe we can drop the slides for a moment and potentially bring the panel up. Maybe we'll go to Wendy first. And we had a question on what are the main roadblocks on the climate finance topics, particularly adaptation and resilience and loss and damage. Is it just the scale of the funding required, or is it skepticism on the part of donors around how that money will be used? Where do you see the key obstacles?
I would say there's a lot of different obstacles. The first thing I would say is that where the focus of regulation and the focus on what is currently measurable, and there is currently more transparency, is all around greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, mitigation in those greenhouse gas emissions and bringing those down is the focus of most funding, because it's what companies are feeling pushed to do by both regulation and consumers, and the fact that it is more measurable. We have frameworks on how to measure, and therefore they're more exposed, right? Adaptation, in contrast, is something that needs to happen in so many different places, in so many different ways. And even though the need is huge, a lot of those projects, the scale isn't the same, and the actors are much, much more diverse. And so I do think there is concern about how that comes together at the right scale, how there's the right visibility on what happens with the funding. Just one small example, if I roll the clock back to Marrakesh, the COP right after Paris, we did a lot of work on adaptation of agriculture. And a lot of that was aggregating agricultural adaptation projects to a scale at which they would truly be investable and there would be visibility around those. So I think a lot of the focus on measurability and regulation to date is around the emission side. I think going forward, we're going to need, and we're getting some of those frameworks that are going to provide a little bit more transparency on the adaptation side, but that is still a challenge. I would separate that from the loss and damage hesitation, which I think, if I were to encapsulate it in a nutshell, is really about opening the door on what is likely to be an astronomical and potentially hard to limit liability once that door is open.
Thanks, Wendy. I would add, again, to highlight the Just Transition deal for South Africa, I think is an excellent example of how to cut through some of those trade-offs and issues, because it was a specific amount of money for a specific transition plan, a specific country that had both internal and external stakeholders aligned around it. And I think that gave everybody comfort to move forward. I'm going to turn to Olga now. We had a question around the race to zero and the 5,000 companies that Rich mentioned at the outset. I think the question really was, what impact is that going to have? Is that cynically greenwashing, or is that going to drive real change, in your opinion?
Thanks, Ed. So I think that this has come up in a few of the answers from Michel and from Judith and Rich already. And I think there's so much to be seen from the kind of the non-state actors, and especially the businesses showing up at this COP in an unprecedented manner. And I think there's kind of four key ways that this is going to really drive change. First of all, you know, the reason that the UN high-level champions role was created was because there was a realization that countries can't do this alone. You need all actors within the ecosystem working together to kind of set up the ambition loop and get it really going. So I think that is actually starting the ambition loop moving much faster. Secondly, I think that it enables the creation of those demand signals that Michel was talking about, as you would have under the First Movers Coalition. It also enables innovation. So things like the Breakthrough Energy Catalyst and other and the Glasgow Breakthroughs, all these private public initiatives, again, it gives them so much more force when you have a whole load of non-state actors and corporates really signing up to them and full commitments. And then finally, I think it really does push countries to look at their own regulations and to see how they can start leveling the playing field to ensure that non-state actors are enabled properly to kind of take action. But of course, as we've been saying, commitments aren't enough. Commitments need to be transparent and they need to be actionable. And so, we need to start moving to put in place plans that can really be put into place and actioned over the next 10 years to really achieve change.
Thanks, Olga. And I think some of what we heard from investors around the appetite for seeing genuine plans that could be interrogated and tracked, I think will help move that dial, as well as from regulators as well. Michel, can I turn to you next? We've had a question around to what extent the progress made at Glasgow was already baked into emissions projections and temperature projections from pre-COP, and to what extent we think it's moved the dial. A complex and contested area, but perhaps you can speak to that.
So let me make a couple of comments on this question, because I related to delivery, collaboration, and speed. So let's talk about speed. The first comment I wanted to make is that all projections that have been made so far were all wrong. The world is moving faster and you get more impact than what everyone was expected. So we made some analysis about projections on the development of solar, of wind, of batteries, both in terms of penetration and in terms of the evolution of costs, which the both are of course related. And in fact, we looked at, the 2010 projections, the 2020 projections, and even longer for 2030, for 2040. They're all wrong, but they're not wrong by 20% or 30%. When we were looking at the solar PV, they were wrong by 36, a factor of 36. And in terms of cost, of a ratio of 3 to 1. And I can continue on wind power, I can continue on EV batteries. So all I'm saying is that everyone, and at corporations level, underestimate the speed at which the market is going, okay? So that's one. Now, coming back to COP, the COP generated a certain number of pledges. You might say it's enough, it's not enough. But what is going to really to drive the change of behaviors and the change of the level of penetration is really that we get the right policies in place and that we got the right supply development, as I was relating to. So I'm convinced, that the Fit for 55 in Europe will be exactly what we need in terms of policy definition. Now it needs to be applied by states, but this will accelerate the change because companies will not have choice and therefore will do what it takes to comply with those regulations. The same is happening in the US. Maybe US is a little bit behind because of Congress discussions, but they already have the plan in terms of what they want to achieve to get to the reduction. And we're talking about China and India. I'm confident that because international, like the US and Europe, will put in place carbon tax at the border, and they will continue to want to export, and they will want to also need to accelerate on their pledges, even if they don't make it official. So they'll be working on it. So all these factors for me is that the speed is going to accelerate. And let me just give you an example of a company that I thought was quite striking. So I discussed with Tata Steel CEO, and what he was saying was, we're going to use Europe as a pilot for us because of the regulation, because of how Europe is advancing on this decarbonization path, we will need to accelerate our own development on our factories, on our plants, to get the decarbonized steel that we need to serve the European market. At the same time, doing that is a lesson and a knowledge and an experience we're going to deploy in India and all over the world, even before the policies will get in place. And therefore, you can see that, you were referring, Judith, to climate leaders. You can see that in each of the sectors, companies are already putting their act together. They understand the 1.5-degree world will be different and they need to adapt their operations and their business model. And therefore, I'm quite optimistic that all these projections that we have now will be reviewed with an acceleration of the decarbonized world.
Thank you, Michel. if we stand right back as well, it's worth noting that projections pre-Paris were kind of in the 4-degree range, and coming out of Paris, they're in the 3-degree range, and now they're getting towards 2. So even if those projections end up being accelerated further, the UNFCCC process has driven down those projected temperature rises. It's working. We need to speed it up. We've got a question around how optimistic are we that some of the essentially legally non-binding commitments around coalitions of the willing, how effective are they going to be in driving to action? And the forests was an example there. I think, as the questioner puts it, there have been similar pledges before. I think there are a couple of quite interesting differences going on with if we just take forests, for instance. So one is you've got many more countries in that declaration than previously, including major forested countries like Brazil and Indonesia. Secondly, there's real financial backing in a way that there has not been before, which is absolutely critical for enforcement. I think Johan Rockström made a great point in one of the plenary sessions around we need to treat reforestation and preventing deforestation as seriously in terms of the effort and activity required as it takes to decarbonize a power sector. So this isn't we don't get a free lunch in the rainforest. We need to put in the right effort. And then I think the other thing that was quite interesting from a forest perspective was the supply chain focus. And I think getting the end consumer to focus on essentially, if we're not decarbonizing your supply chain, but reforesting your supply chain, how can you make sure that your soy, your palm oil, and so on and so forth are not contributing? It will be a major driver. And of course, one where corporates have a great role to play, as Judith was alluding to, in understanding what those supply chains are and shifting them as appropriate. So I hope that's helped with that question. I had another question around South Africa. Maybe, Michel, I'll turn to you on this one. The question was, does this mean that in time South Africa will stop coal mining?
Well, of course it does. It's all about planning and developing the plan to get all the actors and all the stakeholders together, because it requires, as you can imagine, South Africa is in a particular situation because they completely rely on coal. They've got a very high unemployment level, and the level of debt is also very high. So what makes us very proud to have helped South Africa to get to this result is that, if we can make it in South Africa, I think we can make it in all countries, in fact. So it's really a role model. So in this plan that they've adopted, there is a phasing out of coal. Now, it will take some time, and gas will play an important role in accelerating this phasing out. At the same time, they will develop, of course, all the renewable power that is needed to also compensate for the decline of coal. So yes, it means that they will phase out, but they will phase out in a time that is required to make the energy system work, and to make the just transition also in terms of employment. Right. This is where international support is so important, because at the end it's a question of money. They can go faster, but they need more money. They need more money, and they need more support in terms of technology and in terms of the support they get in terms of building hydrogen, building the renewables, and that's international collaboration, and a major opportunity, by the way, for corporations around the world to help supply on those projects. So I hope this answers your question. Is once the plan is agreed, I think there are always options to go faster, but it will require more money and more collaboration. So then it becomes in our hands to support South Africa to go faster.
Ed, can I add one point on this?
Of course.
I think both Wendy and Michel have alluded to this point of just transition. And we often think about it at the level of sort of country level agreements, like what's happened with South Africa. But one of the more interesting efforts I've been involved in over the last few months is with the Council for Inclusive Capitalism with the Vatican, which is a joint effort of business leaders and the Vatican and labor and other parts of civil society to actually translate what it means to do a just transition, not just at the level of sort of country level type agreements, but as companies make their plans. Because if each company gets on a net zero pathway, it's going to make decisions. Some operations are going to be closed or radically reshaped. And how do we make sure that's done in a way that's respectful of the broader societies in which we operate, starting with our own employees and workforces, but also communities that could be impacted and others. And there's a framework out, maybe we can circulate it after the meeting for anyone who is interested, about what it means to have a just transition at the level of an individual, an actor, of a company, and how to think about different kinds of engagement models, different ways of preparation, different ways of building support among both workforces and communities, and to know that this is going to be one of the most important challenges, because if these transitions at local levels are not considered just, then we shouldn't expect that society will be able to necessarily tolerate the kind of changes that are needed to move us towards a net zero pathway. So this just transition thing is easy to think about as some high level theoretical thing, but for many of the business leaders probably listening to this, it's going to become very real about what you do around an individual site and an individual community. And we are all going to need to work very hard to make that a reality. And it's going to require different behaviors than may have been engaged in the past around cost reduction efforts or other things, you know, in terms of how people act.
Thanks, Rich. And maybe we can use that as a segue to talk a little bit about maybe some of the opportunities that exist for business. I think we've talked a lot about some of the pressures that are coming from various places, but where do you or others on the panel see the opportunities and the opportunity for competitive advantage here?
So maybe I can start. Let me make a first statement. The sources of competitive advantage in a 1.5 degree world will be fundamentally different than the one they are today. So, and it's true it's not true the same way in all industries, but it's true in all industries. So the thing is, the earlier you start building your competitive advantage for 2030, the better off you are, because in certain industry, the change can be quite fundamental. When I'm talking about steel, you know, shipping, etc., it's a very different element. Now, what we're seeing is that those who move first are starting to build some important advantages, both because in terms of the revenues that they get, they start changing their portfolio. So I said there's a question of demand, but there's already, you know, a lot of important new markets that are opening, whether it's in the electrical vehicles, in the batteries, in the renewables, you name it, but also in regenerative agriculture. So that there's a number of new ways of doing business, and for those who seize them, there are opportunities. But it's also that there is more and more demand for decarbonized products. And I've discussed with, you know, a number of companies that are already telling us, so it's particularly true in Europe, but not only in Europe, that there starts to be scarcity, even in 2025, on decarbonized steel, on decarbonized, you know, on batteries, on, as you know, on the metals that you need, there needs to be scarcity on plastics, recyclable plastic. So taking those positions now enable you to start building your portfolio in advance for others. I think there's another element that is starting to appear, is that you get a better financing. The access to financings becomes more and more attractive and less attractive for those who don't. So that's another source of advantage. There's clearly also a source of advantage on the employee side, on the recruiting side. So you start having a number of elements that show you that both on the capital, both on the operations and the demand, you start seeing advantages. So I think that's important. The other one that I wanted to say, because I said policies are very important. Now, governments are completely lost in defining the right policies at the right level. So those actors that are climate leaders, that can influence the policy so that it's actionable, it makes sense, and it's going into the right direction, will influence those policies and therefore will create an advantage as well.
Thank you, Michel. Judith, can I turn to you? We've had a question around the contribution of information technology to climate change, and I suspect you might also think about the contribution it can make to the solution.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Wendy and I had a discussion with one of the largest software companies on the planet at the COP, and what you saw is obviously, you know, that was not the thematic focus of this COP. It's not set up to be, but you definitely saw that a lot of the IT, the software companies followed very closely what was happening from a number of perspectives. Given their energy utilization, the whole question of the decarbonized grid for them is obviously of paramount relevance. And then the other part to it is that we see working with clients across all industries, if you want to have a really clean baseline on where you stand on emissions, have an ambitious target to reduce, measure against it. There's a huge element of insecurity in that because very often 40–50% of the emissions you have as a company are not mapped, right? And it requires enormous manual effort. There is a pretty high error rate in that. So what we do see is a lot of partnerships and coalitions forming of both tech companies and industrial players to say, how can we create solutions that give us our emissions at the push of the button, coming out of our systems, being linked to our ERP systems, so that we have a better baseline, we have objective measurements, we can also comply to a lot of the emerging disclosure standards a lot better. And finally, with that, you know, be also much quicker in designing green product, having a proof of how they're made up. So we see that it's as much, if you look at IT and tech, it's obviously part of the problem given the energy utilization and consumption. It's also it has to be a very big part of the solution on the data, the AI question, to make sure we can map emissions, we can map reductions properly.
Thank you, Judith. Now we're almost at time. Rich, do you have any final thoughts to wrap?
30 seconds. I'm not going to try to recap everything that happened at COP. That clearly takes a much longer time. I think as we look ahead, it's about 3 words. It's about committing. Many have committed, but there's a lot more to do to get the level of ambition we need. It's about acting. This is a decade of action, how to turn it. And it's about engaging within our own communities. Our employees want to be a part of this journey. Our investors want to know that it's real. Engaging within our sectors, engaging within our supply chains, and the cross-sector opportunities of the kind Michel highlighted. We keep those 3 words in mind. Bolder commitments, act, engage. I think we sort of have our marching orders to try to make some real progress here looking ahead.
Thanks, Rich. And thanks to everyone for engaging with us by joining this webinar. It's really appreciated. I think it was a great conversation.